G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and so far you're having a great week. Now of course as always we do have a lot to go over. Of course we'll look at the maps, we'll look at some data, we'll look at some geolocations to talk about the battlefield. Then we'll look at strikes, potential goals as well. So from the tactical level to the strategic level, and then we need to look at the political level and much larger than just what we look at in Ukraine and Europe. We need to look at of course what is happening in China right now between Russia, China, India. We need to go a little bit further and speak about this multipolar world that is developing. And the thing is, we don't know where the line that's actually crossed, where that event horizon is before we are in that. We may not actually realize, if that makes sense. We'll talk about India. India is doubling down on Russian oil. The US, they are doubling down on trying to impact further sovereignty of even allied nations. We'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll look at the US and their hard power and how that has reduced over the last decades and has been hollowed out, and what is responsible for this and the potential for great state or great power conflict in the future. As we know, tensions have never been higher. So let's start with the strikes and maybe some goals. So down in Crimea, we know Ukraine is having a lot of recent success with long-range FPV drones. Now, down at the Simferopol airbase, we do see 2 Mi-8 helicopters have been targeted by these drones, as well as a tug boat. You'll see the tug at the end of the footage here. So we see then the second Mi-8 being struck over the top and into this one, and then the tugboat at the end. Again, the actual damage confirmation to these at this point in time, I cannot confirm to the tug there. Now, there has been a meeting with the Russian General Staff, with Gerasimov, as well the Ministry of Defense. Now, in the background, there's this map, and of course we can see where Ukraine is sitting here, where Crimea may sit, where the borderline that Russia has redrawn. And if you put this actually onto a map of Ukraine, you get a better idea. Of course, we have area of Crimea, we have Donetsk, Luhansk, and you can see where Kharkiv is. But you can see that by this map, wanting to occupy Odessa and Mykolaiv, so the entire east and the entire south. Of course, the Black Sea sits down here. This would be catastrophic for a country like Ukraine with now access into the Black Sea. Now, what is the possibility of this? This would still be very far-fetched to gain any foothold on the right bank of the Dnieper River, but it is interesting to see that. Again, this is only what Russia has claimed to have annexed, so it will be interesting to see maybe down the line what occurs, but you know, you can make over your shoulders all the sorts of things you would like to dream and make up. So let's have a look at the maps. Now, we need to go back and let's have a look over August and these numbers that we have seen. Of course, we are September the 2nd here in Australia, but numbers up to September 1. So what we see is that Deep State has had a decrease, I believe, of about 16% from the month prior, down to a 464 kilometre squares, close enough. Still up from the year before. Now, I am not surprised to see this at all. Now, firstly, we'll wait for Syriac and AMK's numbers to come in, but you can see that in the recent months they were more similar. I'm not surprised to see this at all. From an attritional warfare aspect, any movement on the front line, it's a byproduct of that attrition. I do still believe in the coming months, there will be months we'll see much larger movements. That doesn't mean at the end of the year, it could be into next year, that becomes further byproduct of areas like Pokrovsk, Kupiansk potentially coming under control, Konstantinivskia, that will then have larger movements through much more open areas, not these then more urban agglomerations, right up to then the remaining sectors in the Donbass. But again, not surprised to see that at all, especially if we don't know, there's a lot reporting there's a strategic regrouping going on currently. So let's actually go on to the maps. Now, we've had a look at the map already, so you know where these areas are and the colour coding I'm sure you're familiar with. But let's come down into Pokrovsk, as we do have an update from Mr. Thorkill about this movement in the direction of Malanivkia into Murnay and then Malanivkia. What this map never showed. So we're going to talk about this whole Pokrovsk sector, but we'll start here. Now, he says that Malinivka is once again in Russian hands, and this is in the same region that the Ukrainian Skala has withdrawn to their starting positions in these areas. Deep State and other channels on Telegram in recent days, so the Russians deployed several Marine units and have redeployed from other sectors on the front. And this is many people saying there's a regrouping around this area, but it never showed this movement to Malinivka. There's a lot of people questioned it anyway. We know there was some geolocated footage, especially up this tree line, but it appears that it has been then closed back up. We'll have a look down to the south near Chernishini. We see that Deep State is confirming a Russian advancement in this direction. Let's have a look on the Suryak maps. Somewhat different direction, but we can see out from Zorove in the same direction to the dead east of here. Here's showing that there is some movement. Again, a lot of maps are showing a lot more control into Pokrovsk itself. Now, before we move on to the eastern side, let's talk about Novokonomenchne in this Mykolaiivka area, Moloubivka, the area where that push up to Merne occurred. And we do see a number of Ukrainian geolocations in here today. So from this footage, we do see movement of Ukrainian forces and a Ukrainian flag flying as well. And I'll show you the geolocations here. So near Mykolaiivka, near Novokonomenchne, I'm not sure where these actually to separate. It's probably down this tree line here. But this does not mean, as a lot are reporting, the complete liberation of this area. Again, the threshold for confirming that, as well as where the front line is sitting here, as well as flag waving operations we are seeing both Ukrainians and Russians carry out in a lot of areas. We know this area is highly liquid and a lot of pressure being applied at the bottom end, so from Moloubivka through to Zelene on this pocket at the moment. It'll come up onto this Pokrovsk push. Of course, the Zoloty Kolodya's Kushriv Yar, where we showed yesterday that all the neutral or even pro-Russian maps are showing significantly poorer situation than this map is showing for the Russians in here. So let's have a quick look at then what Suryak is saying. And he's talking about on this eastern side, so the Popov Yar, Poltavkia area, showing that they are then growing this area. In this front, during the last 4 days, Russian army advancing towards Sofivka and Rosnivka, quarries taking control of the serious positions in these directions. So trying to further envelop Shakhovka, moving the direction of Sofivka, where we know that there are then offensives launched from the Ukrainians into that direction, as well as out from the Dobropilia-Rubizhne front too. So keep an eye on this whole area in here. But again, those kilometre squares is a very poor indicator of who is winning the war. You could absolutely be losing massive amounts of ground, but be winning an attritional war. It's just the only rock solid data we actually have. Now, I know a lot of people on this website have this idea that the casualty rates of which the MODs, both Russian and Ukraine, release are, or talk about on more of the Russian side, are rock solid numbers. And what I'm saying is if you're plugging that into your data, you're going to get very false outcomes come of it, because as far as I'm aware, any figures around that in this war, other than somewhat from Media Zone or their UA losses, are greatly either inflated or deflated for propaganda information purposes. So let's move our way up into the Terni area. No changes shown on this map today, but let's have a look at what Suryak is speaking about in here. Now we get the Terni area, and he's showing near Torshke that the Russians are entering and making ground in this Zadachne Torshke area, but then further exploiting to the north of here what would make sense, even by this map, the areas that are getting squeezed against, of course, these reservoirs in here. It would make sense for this to be under Russian occupation or at least control. Then we see this area too, Zedezhne, Sendrulahove, Dobrasheve area. We do see one final update by Suryak Maps. He shows on the northern Novomaylivkia that Russia has taken over the the eastern side of this. We did see a geolocation in there the other day, and further movement indicating from this in the direction of Dobrasheve as well. That expansion that we are seeing occur on that area. Highly ignored, but highly dangerous as well. Let's move our way up into Kupiansk. Of course, we saw this blue come in here after that finger of a Russian envelopment came around in the direction of Moskovsky. Now, we do have a geolocation to confirm this today. So this is the geolocation right here, right down, it's just to the right probably of where I've put this arrow there. It could be slightly incorrect, but what we do see is near then a house. We do have footage of a casualty evacuation going on and then shelling there, but we do know in this grey and in this blue there, it's just further confirmation of that pushback that has occurred, and that got very, very dangerous, but still keep an eye out on this area. Now let's push our way down into Siversk, and we see where this train line is here. Again, in Siversk, even the Russian command here has spoken about how good Ukraine's defense is, but what we have seen over the past week and a half, the Crimea forest completely fall apart, as well as over the past couple of months, Verkhonomayansk all the way to Severodvinka start moving too. But down in the south, where we forget about a fair bit, in Vreminkia, Playfra speaks about this. The amount of trench systems dug in the Siversk-Herdsky railway line, fierce battles have raged in these trenches for 3 years. As of today, they're located in Russian-controlled territory, so pushing on so many axes at once. We'll continue moving our way down onto the Konstantinivsky Toretsk pocket. We see, Suryak maps, speaking of just further movements in the direction of Ivano-Pilia, Pleshnivka in here to further movement, just grinding away in these sectors. Again, not surprised to see it. We'll move our way down. We see Red Check just to the north of Temerivka, to the south of Malivka on the Velika Huliapol front line. Again, this is shown on the Suryak map here, but as well, ground being made to the south of Obrutne. Obrutne sits just in here. You can somewhat see the labelling there. Now, Velika Novosilk, we have the last map update. You see Dashne right in here. We have a Russian flag going up in Dashne. Again, this just proves that it is in grey zone. We know there's a lot of movement, shallow movement on both areas of the front line. And as we've seen the front line grow more porous, there's been a lot more than geolocations that are behind the line that may not confirm pure advancement, and the increase in grey zone as well. So let's talk about India, China, Russia, what is happening and how the US is feeling a lot like this at the moment. And we'll clarify some things too. Now, I see a lot of people tweeting about this at the moment and fighting back, saying, well, America is still a superpower. No shit. What these people need to do is they need to look up what uni means, think maybe unicycle, and what multi means. America will remain a superpower. No one's questioning that. It will remain a regional hegemon. They don't have any competition in their region. But what is changing is the unipolarity of America. So one is in the 90s and the early O's to a multipolar world where you have multiple dominant power Schwerpunkt as far as centers of gravity of the power. Now, China, they have the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity. India has the world's most populous state and the largest diaspora, and Russia has the most resources, the most conventional warfare offensive experience, and the largest nuclear arsenal. Now, although these are not formed into a single institution, and this is not a bloc who should be shrugged off and not a bloc that will be easily intimidated, they have come together as much as they have been pushed together by the West, especially by the US. And I think this just shows the misunderstanding, just that you're just not getting it, that is occurring in the American elite when they're not on their island. So the chronological order of these tweets is amazing. India, China, Brazil, and others prop up Putin's war machine by buying cheap Russian oil. How do you feel your purchase might have resulted in the deaths of innocent civilians, including children, being killed? And then having threats directly onto Norway's sovereign wealth fund. Someone needs to give Lindsey Graham a dictionary to see what sovereignty means, because your country is built on the foundations of that. For not wanting to do business with Caterpillar because of Israel. And the order of these tweets and not being able to draw a line between this, just do not get it. And this is where you see, this is where at the end of the day, what India say they're doing is following their independence, sovereignty, and security. And Norway has obviously made a decision and gone, we don't want Norwegian wealth in their sovereign wealth fund, which comes from then their oil industry. We don't want that going into areas like Caterpillar due to the exact reasons you say out here below. And that American relationships is getting super, super strained. And what I'll say is just sort of not getting it. And we see Trump tweet this. What a few people understand is that we do very little business with India, but they do a tremendous amount of business with us. In other words, they sell us massive amounts of goods, their biggest client, but we sell them very little. Until now, a totally one-sided relationship. And it has been for many decades. The reason is that India charged us, until now, such high tariffs, the most of any country, that our businesses are unable to sell to India. It has been a totally one-sided disaster. Also, India buys most of its oil and military products from Russia. Very little from the US. They have now offered to cut their tariffs to nothing, but it's getting late. They should have done so years ago. Just some simple facts for people to ponder. So let's have a look at this. The goods and services trade relationship of UXS export to India, about 83 billion, and US imports from India are around about 130 billion. And he is correct in this, but Washington tolerates this because India is seen as a counterweight to China, and a lot of the goods as well, that there's more to go one way than the other, especially with cheap pharmaceuticals. And India is not backing down on this oil. India's pushed back against US pressure to cut crude oil imports from Russia, claiming New Delhi has not broken any rules. From this gentleman here, Hardeep Singh Puri, who's a union oil minister, has said India's adherence to all international norms prevented a catastrophic $200 per barrel shock. Some critics allege that India has become a laundromat for Russian oil. Nothing could be further from the truth. Of course, we've seen White House trade advisor Peter Navarro say that they were profiteering at the expense of Indian people needs to stop, also alleging that this is Modi's war. Although I would suggest people to follow the money and see who else is buying so much of this, and maybe who's the largest then supplier of diesel to Ukraine too. Let's continue. Scott Bessent, US Treasury Secretary, accused the country's wealthiest families from profiteering. The Navarro said the nation was fueling the Russian war machine and nothing but a laundromat for the Kremlin. And Puri has pushed back and said India has not broken any rules. New Delhi's Russian imports were compliant with G7 price cap mechanism that was designed to limit Moscow's revenue, yet also keep crude flowing. India has stabilized markets and kept global prices from spiraling. And it's the goalposts that have shifted here, not the purchasing of this product. When Europe halted purchases in the wake of the Ukraine war, that India took advantage of the $20 a barrel discount. India is unlikely to stop Russian imports unless a global ban is imposed. I don't know how you enforce a global ban, as the issue was morphing into a political decision on the nation's freedom to choose rather than purely an economic one. And this is where that has changed, is it's gone from an economic decision of move away from oil to an encroachment as a political decision on independence and sovereignty, and India not wanting to be pushed over from that. It's actually reinforcing now to India energy independence as well as power balancing the other major players. According to Reuters, on 20th of August 25, India's oil imports are set to rise in September despite the 50% tariff coming into effect. Puri said further, the truth is that there is no substitute for the world's second largest producer supplying nearly 10% of global oil. Those who are pointing fingers ignore this fact, and ignoring what may happen if there's then a complete ban on this, with the oil markets either spiraling up or down or flooding or restriction on the markets too, what was initially the reason to buy within these caps. But now that is shifting as there's more and more pressure because the US pressure and sanctions isn't working against Russia. Now they're having to look well outside of their wheelhouse. But what you get is you get what we're seeing in China at the moment. Now let's speak about the growing friction and tensions between the great states. So this gentleman here, Andrew A. Michter, has a great thread on this. He's a professor of strategic studies at UF Hamilton, and we'll give our thoughts on this at the end. As the risk of great power conflict grows, the West continues to refuse to recognise that unless we return to the enduring varieties about what constitutes hard power, we will lose. India's latest apparent decision to come closer to China and Russia should be an alarm bell. Newsflash: Washington hasn't succeeded at prying Russia away from China or shutting down the Ukraine war because our adversaries can make judgments about our hard power indices and relative power distribution worldwide. If anything, it's pushed these closer together. 20 years ago, would Russia and China behave this way? There is no strategic sleight of hand, no pivot, no China first that can compensate for hard power deficits. No amount of ground rhetoric can offset gaps in our defence industrial base and the military that is simply too small for purpose. The enemy gets a vote too. We still get our way with our allies and weaker adversaries. What I will say is we're talking hard power here, but our soft power or America's soft power to their allies, so look at Norway, and to weaker adversaries, that soft power is massively falling apart too. I think more so than the hard power. But unless the US rebuilds its industrial base, reshores key supply chains, cuts China off from continued access to our educational institutions and our research and development base here at home, we know how it ends. Time to wake up. Over the past 3 decades, we fought endless scheduled wars that ate up most of the stockpiles we accumulated during the Cold War. At the same time, our adversaries have been arming at speed and scale. Our corporate greed masquerading as globalization gutted our industry, that it hollowed it out and has moved not only the manufacturing, but the skills, the research overseas as well. And look at China. While Russia and America and Israel and Ukraine and the West, when all the Western European larger powers just trick down all of their weapon systems, China's not using any of them. Now, people will say, oh, China's sending drones to Russia. They may well be. But if China's manufacturing base was behind the Iran drone, we wouldn't see 100 a night. We wouldn't see 1,000 a night. We could see 10,000 a night. Open borders and out-of-control immigration policy stressed our national fabric to a breaking point, polarising society and fueling radical policies. Our schools and universities stopped transmitting our cultural DNA to next generations and too often disavowed our history. But at the end of the day, we can blame it on this, but at the end of the day, this still is government decisions being made, and that Wall Street is pushing this onto the government, trying to increase profits too. America's establishment elite, both corporate and policy, lost all sense of servant leadership. They began to believe their own narrative, that they have been chosen not to govern on behalf of their fellow citizens, but over them. Privilege overpowered mutual obligation. The American Republic is still young and endowed with unique attributes from its geography, through its resources to human capital, but it needs a fundamental change in that we relearn the basics again, that there is no hard power without a robust industrial economy. Although, given the nature of the USD underpinning the global economies, this is why you don't end up with that industrial manufacturing base. It becomes far too expensive. And that national cohesion is foundational to national strength and resilience for its nations nor armies that go to war. That elites must put national security first above profit or expedience. And he's right in saying that it's nations that go to war. And the common citizens often understand the virtues of democracy better than DC. I believe that this country will surge again, but we will go through turbulence like we haven't seen since World War II. We will need to work hard to earn it forward. It's about leadership and speaking the truth to our citizens. No shortcuts, then Americans will surprise you again. Now, what I'll say about this is his thread, it does hit on some very hard truths, but like many, it doesn't offer a real plan. It doesn't accept that there are now constraints that may not have existed in previous decades. He's right that America's elites have become detached. They're living in their own echo chamber while degrading and hollowing out the industrial base that actually underpins a state's hard power. We've seen this everywhere. Look at Europe trying to build up any amount of hard power to support Ukraine, let alone in a great state war. And he's also right about that cohesion, leadership, and national purpose matter as much as weapons. But you can't fight wars with narratives and rhetoric. You need steel, men, industry, unity. And the issue is that America can't simply just wake up and return to some 20th century mobilization, industry, manufacturing. That's not that simple. Globalization not only redistributed power, it redistributed so much knowledge as well. And China adapted faster, and India is now playing its own balancing game. That you don't pull them back into line with alarm bells and threats. That America must adapt to a multipolar reality and pick your battles. And America, we in the West, we gutted our industry chasing cheaper products, higher profit margins, and the illusion of tackling emissions. And China, they just picked up everything that we then threw away. And in the coming decades, America will struggle to remain an equal power. It may even become a second power, and we don't know how that transition looks. Without the unique conditions of the 50s or through the second half of the 20th century, the US can't just rebuild that base, can't just wake up, so to speak, while maintaining domestic standard. Leaders will have to accept there are restraints, have to prioritise where power goes, and recognise a growing risk of American overextension as well. So I agree with everything that Mr. Michter says, but it's not that easy to solve. And that no one anywhere seems to actually be laying out a plan of how to tackle the hard power issue or even the massive reduction in soft power as well. That you have American elites looking to tackle a country like Norway because Norway is acting within their independent sovereign interest. Or India, and what you're doing is just pushing countries together or you're pushing countries apart. America is pushing the EU together, but it's pushing the EU as a bloc away from America. And it's pushing India further apart and into the arms of Russia and China. And this is this transition that we don't know how is going to look, as there's a reduction in power, an increase in power to maybe a levelling or over. Can that be done peacefully? Could we see overextension? Could we see isolation? Well, the next decades will tell. Legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.